Hi there. Sorry about that. I clearly haven't been paying my internet bill. We all know what the topic's about. It's what it says in the tin, what Dutch political parties think about the EU. And joining me today are two highly qualified people to talk about this topic. The first is Caroline de Gruyter, who is the European Affairs correspondent and political commentator for the Dutch newspaper NRC and writer of several very good books on the EU, and indeed is one of my favourite columnists. So I'm delighted to be joining her today. And with her is Rem Korteweg, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Dutch think tank Clingendael Institute, who has just put out a fascinating paper on this very topic, which I can heartily recommend, which is Dutch Elections, What Are the Parties' Views on Foreign Affairs, which has a big chunk on what they think about the European Union. Now, what I would like to start with is just firing as quite a simple question at our two panelists, which is, from a colleague of mine in Brussels, who's Christoph Schmidt, who works at the Trouw, a Dutch newspaper, and he explained the Dutch election for people such as myself who aren't Dutch, and he said, this is the most boring Dutch election in decades. Now, I would like to start by asking you both, why is he wrong? What's actually really interesting about this election, and what are people missing? What's the most fascinating thing for you? So let's start with you, Caroline.
Okay, boring. It looks boring because it's a little bit sterile in a way. It has been sterile for a long time. Issues that normally cause heated debates like immigration, Eurozone issues have largely remained out of the debate this time. And it looked for a long time as if voters were going to hand Mr. Rutte his fourth mandate as a prime minister. But in recent days, things have changed somewhat. We can go deeper into this, while it's been so sterile and why these issues have not really come up. I must add, I haven't seen all the debates because I'm not in the Netherlands and I'm far away. And TV is very national, so some things I simply cannot see. But what has happened in the last couple of days, and it also shows in the title of this little seminar, is that somehow the EU elephant is starting to play a role. And what you see is an interesting development, I would say, in the center-left sphere, where you see the new pan-European party Volt surging in the polls. They came out of nowhere. Till a week ago, everybody said, oh, they're doing very well, they can get 1 seat. And now it looks like they may even get 3 seats. What comes out, we don't know. There are many undecided voters in the Netherlands. And secondly, I hesitate to call her a left-winger because I don't think she really is, but she's rather progressive, liberal, centrist. Sigrid Kaag, of the new leader of D66, is also doing well in the polls. And this is interesting because Volt seems to be cannibalizing D66 with their very open, pro-European, internationalist point of view. And a lot of voters do think that D66 has not emphasized this aspect of their program enough. So you would expect them to eat the heart out of D66, but they don't. And D66 is growing. And in the past couple of days, Kaag has done some good debates. So she's peeling off Rutte's shine as, the stable crisis time leader a little bit. Till now, voters seemed very hesitant to abandon Rutte, even if discontent with his government's policies is growing in the Netherlands, clearly growing. But they didn't see another safe pair of hands to put the country, the country's leadership into. And this seems to be changing somewhat. I still think Rutte is going to win, but there's some kind of a challenge emerging. In 2017, the main challenge came from the far right, from Wilders. It was all about Islam and Nexit and so on. And now the challenge, since the last few days, is coming a little bit more from the center left, and this I find interesting. It's not boring at all, and it's. I think it's also good news in for Europe. Let's leave it there.
To you, and what's been the most interesting thing for this election campaign for you?
It's a good question, because I think Dutch elections are always determined in the last 48 hours. And so we haven't really reached that point yet. I mean, this evening we're going to have a very important final debate between the party leaders, and that might throw up some surprises. I think, generally speaking, Caroline is correct. The rise of Volt is a surprise. I mean, perhaps for the viewers who don't follow Dutch politics too closely, when Caroline mentions that they're surging and we're looking at 3 seats, it doesn't sound that much, but actually it does mean that as a small party, you are able to have influence in a political context that is so fragmented. So perhaps also just to remind viewers, we currently have 13 parties in the Dutch Parliament taking seat. After these elections, we'll have anywhere between 15 and 16, which would be a national record. And so there is a huge degree of political fragmentation taking place. And in that context, small parties can actually really push the agenda. And that's why I think Volt is significant. Also, it's significant as a correction to the thesis that Dutch politics is all about Euroscepticism. We see that the pendulum is to some degree swinging back. Yes, after these elections, we will have probably 3 Eurosceptic parties represented. Effectively, it means that Geert Wilders's PVV, who many viewers will probably be familiar with, has fragmented into 3 big chunks, or 3 chunks of varying size. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's now this emergent Erasmus generation party who is deeply convinced of its pro-EU roots and thinks that the government should be conditioned to talk more about Europe and to take Europe more into consideration. I mean, I don't think the campaign has been boring. I think it's been somewhat consumed by one issue, and that has been Corona. But Corona and the pandemic as such throw up a huge degree of very important questions for the future of the Netherlands. But if you're interested, like Caroline and myself, in sort of, okay, well, what does that mean in a European context? And how does Corona also change your Dutch politics towards Europe? That has been completely absent. So if that's the prism through which you view politics, then I agree with the fact that it hasn't yet delivered. But again, the last 48 hours are all that matters.
Oops, I think we have lost Duncan yet again. Duncan, are you still there? So let me add a little bit to what Rem just said. I think we mostly agree on these matters. What is an interesting aspect of you are all correspondents, I guess, in Brussels, but covering the Netherlands from the outside. The Netherlands has appeared to be very Eurosceptic, increasingly Eurosceptic in the last couple of years. But when you look at the polls, like the Eurobarometer, and the European Parliament often regularly does polls as well, time and again you see that the solid majority, and since Brexit and Trump and Putin and so on, I think even more solid majority of the Dutch, maybe they're not very happy with Europe and the way it functions, but they're certainly happy to be in the EU. They're happy with the membership, and this kind of critical satisfaction, I would say, is not really expressed in the Dutch Parliament. I find people in the Parliament more Eurosceptic than the Dutch public, and what you saw in recent years is that Eurosceptics, whatever they said about Europe, they never really got an answer. The government parties never really answered. And now, all of a sudden, the answer is coming. People are voting for parties because they want a Volt or D66 or maybe others to answer. You know, what are we doing in Europe? And can we please also discuss the benefits of it? And if something isn't functioning well, let's sit down, roll up our sleeves and start working on it instead of moaning and calling for exits all the time, which is not very constructive. And so I think in a way, the EU is still not discussed, as Rem points out, but by voting for these parties or indicating they want to vote for these parties, many people are saying this has to stop, this sort of negative spiral. Sorry, Duncan, we were continuing the discussion without you, but I see you're back again, or have you left us yet again?
No, he's frozen again.
Oh dear. What do you think, Rem? Do you agree with this?
Well, I think there's yes, it's true, but we shouldn't yet exaggerate what's happening on sort of the pro-EU flank. I think in the end, you know, Geert Wilders will probably come in second place, although perhaps in a shared second place with the Christian Democrats, or perhaps even also with D66. So he's still a strong force to be reckoned with. But what I think this election has shown is that those parties that would very likely form a government, which are VVD and D66, have both already excluded, and I think Christian Democrats to a certain degree as well, yes, the Christian Democrats as well, have already excluded working with Geert Wilders in a new coalition. And so in some ways there has already, they're going to be an opposition voice. And that means that the Eurosceptics are viewed in a different light. I wouldn't, however, exaggerate the pro-European, if you can use that term, credentials of the VVD and the Christian Democrats. I think on a number of areas, and we'll see what really happens during the coalition formation phase, but a number of points in their election manifestos are really quite tough when it comes to future EU policy. I mean, the Christian Democrats want to talk about the future of the freedom of movement of people. And that's code word for what we saw in, say, 2014, 2015, coming out of the United Kingdom, that there should be limits to the freedom of movement of people. The VVD party has a very strict anti-migration stance, which I think is also going to lead, if it's put into practice, is going to lead to tenuous relationships with say, Southern European EU member states. And so, yes, I think there is a correction taking place in politics, and that the pro-EU voice is going to be much more vocal. I'm not sure, however, whether that's going to be translated into a new honeymoon towards the European Union with a new coalition government. Ultimately, I think the Christian Democrats and the VVD, again, most likely to be partners in a new coalition, are quite Eurocritical, very Eurocritical when it comes to migration, as I said, but also very Eurocritical on the issue of, say, the Next Generation EU Fund, or the necessity to do whatever it takes to keep the Eurozone strong. And so that's going to lead to real questions moving forward.
So just going back to one of your previous points, Caroline, you said that there's a disconnect between how Eurosceptic MPs are and how Eurosceptic voters are. How did that gap emerge?
I think the gap is a very old gap. The Netherlands has always been a little bit ambivalent about its central position in Europe, and indeed about being one of the founding fathers. If we go back, look, for Angela Merkel, when there's a crisis, she goes on television and she can say, look, for historical reasons, which I don't need to explain, we cannot let Europe down. We have to take this big step. She did this during the Euro crisis. She did this during the refugee crisis, and again a year ago, almost precisely, or in April it was, when she discussed the Corona Rescue Fund with France. For a Dutch prime minister, this is much harder to do, because the Dutch position in Europe has always been rather ambivalent. It started with France and Germany just after the war, and the Dutch were not ready for that. But they felt they couldn't stop it, they couldn't block it. The former occupier and the one we always love to hate on the continent, France, were doing a pact together. I mean, they didn't like it one bit. But then the Dutch had just lost their colonies, and they had a free trade agreement already with Boom in Germany. So they realized, we're here on the continent. We love to do business with the US and the UK. But for the moment, we are where we are. So let's join and water it down from the inside. And they have done this for a long time, except for a period of about 20 years when they managed to get the UK into the EU. Then the Dutch were extremely happy, taking very pro-European initiatives, going very far. They joined Schengen, they joined the Euro, and so on. And then they looked over their shoulder and they noticed the British were no longer following them. So they're always a little bit, and since then, since the mid-90s again, they're more or less in a bind. People love the UK, they love the US in the Netherlands. This is a traditional cultural thing. And Dutch politicians have always found it very difficult to explain. And you don't do this quickly in a soundbite, as you notice now. So they just duck the issue. They duck the issue, what are we doing in Europe? And what is exactly our position? What do we stand for? What do we want? And this is why during election campaigns, usually Europe is not really discussed. It's the elephant in the room. But a lot of people, and you see this in I was just when you were dropping out of our conversation, what you often see is a discrepancy between what people say in the polls, expressing the vast majority is happy with membership, full stop. They may not be very happy with the EU, but they're happy in the EU. But you don't see this very much reflected in Parliament and in the public debate, indeed. So what's happening now with Volt and D66 is not going to change everything. It's not suddenly going to make the Dutch very happy in Europe, as Rem says, or with Europe rather. But finally, this voice comes out, and that I think is very significant. At least you can have a debate now about issues, about several European issues.
Interesting. So, Rem, this sort of Dutch position in the EU, that they're very happy in it. They're in it. They're not going anywhere. But at the same time, they are happy to be the handboy.
Just answer the question, Rem.
I can answer. I can try to answer what he might have wanted to ask, which I think Duncan was getting to the point that the Netherlands is pretty sure it's in the European Union, but it's still kind of uncomfortable with the European Union and how to make those two things go together. I mean,
Sorry.
Oh, there you go, Duncan. I was trying to
guess.
I was trying to get your brainwave.
Sure you know where it's going.
Ask the question. Ask the question.
Talk among yourselves. It's just it's that VVD position of just being a handbrake, slowing things down, gumming things up. Is that almost the position of the median Dutch voter? They're in Europe, but they do want to sort of slow it down a bit, make sure they don't get too carried away.
Yeah, I think the best way I would describe what the median Dutch voter thinks about the EU is that it's fine as is. It's kind of it's good that we're in the European Union. We love roaming. We love the freedom of movement that it enables for us. Vacation, holidaying everywhere. The internal market certainly is a benefit. Although I think the median Dutch voter doesn't really appreciate what the economic benefit is to the Dutch economy of actually being in a very integrated regional economic bloc like the single market. But I think generally that's what people get. I think people also understand that it's necessary for Europe to come together to tackle some of the big challenges out there. I think on climate, for instance, you see this very clearly in some of the polling that we've also done at the Institute, that people actually think that climate change is primarily something the EU should fix rather than national governments. I think in terms of shielding the Netherlands for the impact of, say, turbulence in the neighborhood, that the EU also gets credit. But beyond that, there's not a huge amount that I think people want the EU to do more. And it's translated into a rather defensive stance on the side of the government. The government has this image of being Eurosceptic. I don't think it's Eurosceptic at all. I think it's playing a defensive card in a context where it thinks that Macron's ideas about the future of the Eurozone or this tendency to move towards a transfer union are going too far. It's not necessarily that people say, well, we're against the EU. It's just that it's gone far enough. I'd argue one element which positions the Netherlands in a rather positive or constructive light is that the Netherlands has been among those countries which are really beating the drum of rule of law inside the European Union. Now, if it were deeply Eurosceptical, as some media like to paint the Netherlands, then why would it be making such a fuss about the rule of law in places like Poland and Hungary? And if you talk to government officials and even politicians, they will tell you, look, we are emphasizing this element of the rule of law because we want the EU to be coherent and strong, and the single market has to function and that depends on rule of law and on transparency. And so this is one particular area where I think that the Netherlands is trying to show that it is more European than many outsiders like to make it out to be.
Interesting. So, Caroline, could you almost argue that Mark Rutte is a bit of a secret Europhile? That while he's sort of very quite happy to sort of kick it a bit in domestic politics, when it comes to the European level, although he says no initially, he'll say yes eventually. So with the recovery fund, his opening offer was €0 in grants, and he ended up with 390 billion, which is quite a big shift. So is Mark Rutte, after 11 years in the European Council, is he a secret Europhile after all?
I think the Netherlands is much more constructive, especially since the Brexit vote. The day after, I would say, it started, the repositioning, is much more constructive in Europe, but it's not talked about again in the Netherlands. And yes, Mark Rutte is I'll give you a few examples, but Mark Rutte just last month was arguing in the February Council, end of February. He was arguing for more vaccine solidarity with African countries, and he did this with Angela Merkel and I think the Swedish Prime Minister and Josep Borrell. Why? Because otherwise China and Russia will come in and stamp through. Put their stamp on policies in Africa. And then you look, as Rem just said, you look at the VVD program, his party's program, and it says in Africa, in development aid, the Netherlands should not become the ATM, you know, the pin machine, you call that. I mean, you have the words and you have the action. What has happened since the Brexit vote? You know, the Netherlands has lost a big ally. Not on every issue, because as we all know, the British, during most of the crisis that we had in the past 10, 15 years, they were just bystanders. Bystanders. The euro crisis, they didn't have the euro. They were just sitting there and watching. Refugee crisis, the same story. They're not in Schengen. It was not their crisis. But in many other ways, on the single market and so on, the Dutch lost a big ally. So if they want to push something in Brussels or to block something in Brussels, they will have to find other allies right now. So they have fanned out all over Europe, and very few people in the Netherlands know this. But when the Brexit vote happened, I was in Vienna, and all of a sudden, I had many phone calls of people from Dutch ministries who wanted to, you know, get to know their colleagues in Austria. Small country, but it was significant. And I heard from people in Spain, I heard the same thing. All of a sudden, the Dutch were trying to do business with the Spaniards. I mean, nowadays, they're writing a paper, the Netherlands and Spain are writing a position paper, whatever, non-paper, on strategic autonomy. Whatever comes out of it, most of the Dutch people, I would argue all of the Dutch people, they have never heard of this and they have no clue, you know. So yes, there's a lot happening for us, more or less insiders. We see it, but it's not discussed in the political arena in the Netherlands. So voters don't know it.
So Rem, just on that point about sort of Dutch working with other countries more closely, how much of a problem is it when you have sort of Dutch magazines picturing sort of Italians on lounges and the implication that there's a sort of Southern Europeans who are constantly on holiday asking hardworking Dutch people for their tax terms? Is that a genuine problem for Dutch diplomacy, or are politicians sort of big enough to sort of shrug it off and just dismiss it as tabloids being tabloids and therefore they can ignore it?
I tend to answer with the latter. The Netherlands is not the only country that has tabloids of a certain slant towards the European Union. Where it does raise problems is if that starts to infiltrate into the Dutch parliamentary debate. And what I do find worrisome is that there is a category of Dutch politician who is very moralizing towards Southern European countries, and says basically that the problems in the south of Europe are all due to lack of reform, and that if only they'd reformed, things wouldn't have escalated the way they did in the terms of the financial crisis. Or, you know, the Minister of Finance, Wopke Hoekstra, on the eve of the discussions over the Corona Recovery Fund, saying, well, we need a reform check, or we need the Commission to also check what kind of reforms countries like Italy or Spain should push through. And this moralizing element is definitely present in our politics. You can't blame Dutch politicians for being proud of their own country, but we sometimes, it does have a category of the pot calling the kettle black. And that becomes problematic if you want to move these ad hoc coalition building initiatives that you refer to forward. So yes, I mean, Caroline is absolutely right. I mean, there are much more intense Dutch-Spanish ties now since Brexit than there were previously. We have the Benelux countries reaching out to the three Baltic states. We have Prime Minister Rutte hosting the Visegrad Four in The Hague at some point in time over the past couple of years. There is, of course, a lot of attention and a lot of ink also spilled on the Dutch leading the Frugals, as well as the Hanseatic league of finance ministers. But let's not forget, if we look at EU trade policy, the innovations coming from the member states in terms of EU trade policy have come from a non-paper written by the Netherlands and France, which really served as a push to move EU trade policy in a direction where conditionalities are now being applied to market access for third countries, conditionalities in the form of sustainability and climate targets. The same thing happened with respect to being much more critical over the role of technology platforms. It was a Franco-Dutch initiative that put that on the table. Is enough domestic attention being spent on these coalitions with, say, southern countries? No, it's not, because the publications like to focus on the frugals, or they like to focus on the Hanseatic League. But again, tabloids are going to be tabloids, and it's interesting to watch what's actually happening on the ground in Brussels or between capitals. That's, I mean, Caroline is absolutely right. Diplomatic presence has been intensified. I mean, traditionally, but this is not particularly unique to the Netherlands, but traditionally, smaller countries could get by simply having a big presence in London, Paris, and Berlin. That's no longer the case. Yes, the Franco-German engine is the dominant engine around which EU policy is made. But if you want to influence that engine, the Dutch need to come together and talk to the Spaniards and the Italians as much as they need to talk to the Danes and the Irish. And so, yes, it does lead to kind of a renaissance of European politics from a Dutch foreign policy angle. But it doesn't percolate to the man on the street, and he won't care about that when he goes to the ballot box.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, if I might chip in. I try to write about these things, showing people that there's a little bit more going on than just yelling at the Italians, let's say. And I receive lots of mails. I mean, we shouldn't exaggerate it either, but people are saying, thank you. There's a thirst. People want this information, but they don't know where to find it. And it is hard to find. So there's a thirst for more information.
Also because sometimes these non-papers are written with a certain degree of secrecy and confidentiality around it.
The very strange Brussels philosophical creation of a non-paper. It's a deep question. So just in terms of the Dutch role in Europe, you'll have Mark Rutte, presumably, as Prime Minister. He, when Merkel goes, will be the longest-serving member of the European Council, an elder statesman of the EU. So, Caroline, how much of a factor do you think that will play? The fact you will have Mark Rutte being the man sat around the table who has more experience than anyone else, who's not called Viktor Orban. Like, how will that affect things?
Affect the elections, you mean?
Or
you mean the assuming he wins? What will the effect be?
He's still there.
Of his
will
experience.
that do anything to change European attitudes towards the EU in the Netherlands? The fact that you will have a very, very prominent politician on the European level.
Okay. I don't think it will change anything overnight. Everybody has known Rutte for a long time. I think they perceive him as reluctantly constructive. Let's put it that way, Rem. Would that be a good description? So they know what they have with him. What could change after these elections, if it transpires indeed that the polls are right and a more pro-European voice is emerging, and gets a place in the government as well. We might see a little bit less of the yelling part against southern countries. It could ease a little, but I don't see a big change. And I think in a lot of capitals they're not very worried about these Dutch elections either. I think they're much more worried about the German elections for once. Not so much about these elections.
Can I come in on this, Duncan?
Of course.
So what's interesting, we looked at the party programs and kind of scored them on their on how they rank in terms of their EU and their foreign policy. And what's actually quite clear is that there is a broad majority of Dutch political parties that want to do more with the European Union. Whether it comes to, for instance, European defense cooperation, I think there's a real clear trend of the Netherlands moving away from a focus on the transatlantic security relationship, moving much more towards European defense initiatives, whether that's CSDP or whether that's European military cooperation in a minilateral guise. But that's a very clear trend. Secondly, you see most parties, including the VVD, really emphasizing the role of the European Union in what the VVD describes as protecting the internal market. So really banging this drum that we need adequate investment screening, that we need a level playing field with countries like China, that we need to perhaps even bring back strategic production chains to the European continent in order to have access to particular goods, say in the medical sector or in terms of critical technologies. That there is real support for the EU playing a much more assertive role in terms of imposing its norms and its rules in trade agreements with third countries. So in that respect, it's across the board. Yes, you except for the Euroceptics. And so it's a fair assumption that in whatever coalition agreement emerges, you will see this more pro-European element reflected in Dutch foreign policy or Dutch government policy towards the EU. Now, where I have my doubts, however, is Mark Rutte is going to be the longest-serving head of government, except for Orban, at a time when Germany is faces a degree of political uncertainty with whoever takes over from Angela Merkel, at a time as well when President Macron is primarily focused on getting re-elected. In that context, the Netherlands, which, as I've described, has a rather defensive approach to, say, economic financial issues in the European context, is the Netherlands going to use that extra clout it has, or is Mark Rutte going to be able to use that extra clout he has as being one of the most senior leaders to move the EU forward? Or on these economic financial issues, is he going to use that clout to, again, re-emphasize that very defensive stance? And that, to me, is still very much a question mark. Because up until now, nothing indicates me, at least, that he has a sort of a proactive, constructive approach on economic financial issues. And it's very much just hitting the brake. But on those other areas, trade, defense, say economic security, you'll see a more pro-European Netherlands emerging.
We've just had a question come in on the chat from Stephen Israel, and he asks, were pro-European parties, B66, Green Links, BBDA, the secret winners of the last election or already? Do you think we've started to see some of an element of pro-Europeanism creep in already, Caroline?
Of the last elections in 2017?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think so. No, and I think in 2017, the big challenge. I remember in the run-up to those elections, everybody thought Geert Wilders would be winning. You know, this was end of 2016, the year of Trump, the year of the Brexit vote. Norbert Hofer almost won the Austrian elections. And people were really saying Marine Le Pen would become French president in a few months' time, and Geert Wilders would remember this? Geert Wilders would win Dutch elections, and of course this has not happened. But I'm not sure I would qualify this as a win for the pro-European. I think this was rather a case of wrong expectations. Huh? I never thought Geert Wilders would win, but you know, all the headlines were focused on Wilders. So, no, I think it was we didn't see an upsurge there of so-called pro-European. I find this very strange. I mean, how can you be pro or against? It's there, you know. Sometimes I ask people, are you pro the Netherlands or against? But there you are. So no, I don't think so.
Yes. Okay. So just in terms of potential future coalitions that there could be, what could you just talk us through the likely outcomes if you had your betting hat on? What do you expect?
Oh gosh.
Yes.
So I would start with the VVD. I don't think it's very likely that a coalition will emerge without the VVD. And let's take that to the bank first. But then it becomes an interesting Rubik's cube. I think, secondly, you'll have the Christian Democrats. But it depends on the division of votes, which parties are going to allow a Christian Democrat VVD combination to get to the magic number of 76, which is the required number of seats to get a majority. And the polls are fluctuating a bit, as I think also Caroline mentioned that. I mean, we really see in this last stretch towards the elections, things are actually moving. Will the current coalition continue? And again, the current coalition is VVD, Christian Democrats, D66, and a smaller Christian party, the Christian Union. Would those three be able to continue without the Christian Union? That would be interesting. It would create more cohesion, I think, in the coalition. But nothing can be ruled out at this point. Could the Social Democrats do better than we expect? Could they join a coalition together with the Christian Democrats and VVD? At the moment, hard to predict which way the chips will fall. But in my view, the core will be made by Christian Democrats and VVD, suggesting that overall the government policy won't be hugely different from the previous government.
Yes. So just on a related question, coalition formation. Last time it took a very long time. Dutch politics became rather Belgian. It was a very long, convoluted process. Is it, Caroline, is it likely to be as difficult this time? Is it likely to be easier? Should we expect a very, very long wait before we have a government? And within that wait, how much do things shift around versus what was in the campaign? How much changes should we expect?
Hard to say, because it depends on the kind of, there are many coalitions that now seem possible. Yesterday I heard even people saying that maybe Rutte, who let's not forget, who was far ahead in the polls. This was new this time. It's like the Corona bonus, safe pair of hands, rally around the flag. He's rapidly losing part of that. The question is how far it will go. But yesterday I heard somebody saying, like, if Sigrid Kaag, if D66 moves smartly, it can rally a lot of voters from the left and even win. Now, I'm not sure this will happen, but so much is shifting nowadays that people even come up with those scenarios. I don't know. It may take a long time because, remember, the fragmentation, which is sometimes called Dutchification abroad. It creates it creates a situation where you have a few big parties splinter, and those splinters are splintering again. So all they do is emphasizing their differences, while some of them are actually pretty close. So if all these small splinters need to be gathered into a coalition government, and they're all emphasizing their differences because they don't want to lose their face, it can take a long time. I mean, I really have no idea how long it will take. One thing, though, during the election debate, many party leaders were were actually very polite and showing themselves as cooperative and in for compromises and so on. So they were clearly making already a sortie towards, I'm in for a ministerial post, or I want my party to be in the next coalition government. So there have been talks behind the screens, apparently, or rumor has it, already about possible coalitions. But it's very hard to say how this will go.
Can I just chip in on that, Duncan? The polls that we are looking at today to inform our discussion right now have a very difficult time taking into account the huge group of undecided voters. So last week, estimates were that about 60 or 70% of the electorate had yet to make up their mind. So when you look at the polls which portray this huge bump for Mark Rutte, take it with a grain of salt. Because, again, polls are notoriously poor at taking into consideration what the undecideds do. And again, it's these last 48 hours, or perhaps the last minutes before they make the little box on the ballot card red, that people decide. So that's going to lead to, I think, some shifts in terms of what we suggest right now. Secondly, and Caroline has hinted at this, the elections are only the first stage into assessing what the new government's policy is going to be, because we have such a pure form of proportional representation, and you have so many parties, and the coalition process needs to take its course. In other words, the real choices on migration, on the Next Generation EU Fund, on climate change, on European defense, they will need to be made in the days and weeks after the vote has actually happened. So read the party programs as like an opening offer by the parties, rather than something they are absolutely going to emphasize during the negotiations. And so we can't at this moment yet tell how firmly some of the stances taking into the party programs, whether they're going to stick. But having said that, and that this gets to your point about whether we will have a lengthy formation process or not. I mean, Rutte has himself hinted at what he hopes to call sort of a two-tier formation process, where very quickly, in general terms, a coalition can come out with a statement on what it wants to do in terms of the corona pandemic and a national recovery plan. Again, recall that about 90% of the discussions in the campaign are all about corona, about potential austerity, about how we open up the economy after lockdown. What do we do with our healthcare system? Do we need vaccination passports or not? And what he was hinting at is perhaps we can do that very quickly and sort of in a matter of weeks rather than months. And that just as the government is not in a caretaker capacity today, even though it's resigned on all other areas of government policy, it's not resigned over the issue of corona. And then have a second tier formation process where they work on, say, the more or the less corona related areas. I think he's hinting at the possibility of getting a coalition accord in headlines, in general terms. And we'll see. If that's the case, then it might go a little bit quicker than we all expect, which would be good, which I would I would favor.
In wholly support. Interesting. So let's just take a few questions from the chat. By all means, ping in extra ones, people who are listening. So just a quick one. Caroline, how influential are EU-level politicians in the Dutch debate, whether Dutch MEPs, whether Timmermans, those sorts of characters? How much of a role do they play, if any?
As far as I can tell, not a lot. It's a very recent phenomenon that in some podcasts, high-ranking Dutch officials in the European Commission or the Council are interviewed, but this is hardly ever happening. There's a large disconnect, more I would say than in other countries, between the national debate on Europe and Dutch people actually working on a day-to-day basis on those issues. So there's a little. Timmermans comes in sometimes. I saw him in a chat yesterday evening, explaining that he's sitting in his attic and he had a hoodie on. And he has two backgrounds. I didn't know this actually. One background is the P van de A for the Dutch, Social Democrat viewers, which he had on yesterday. So it was red with the P van de A logo. And then he says, but tomorrow morning I will have a debate on the environment or climate with one of my colleagues. And so then I quickly, like a curtain, I pull this one aside. And what emerges then is the European Commission logo, So that I happen to see. But there's not a lot of it. No.
Yes. There was another question just on the future of Mark Rutte again. Can you imagine him as a potential future European Council president?
Yes. I think we could all imagine that in 2018. When we were thinking about who would be the top, the new top team in Europe, his name was oftentimes mentioned. In fact, 3 pro-Europe speeches he gave in 2018 in Zurich, Berlin, and Strasbourg kind of hinted at something that looked like a campaign to have one of those positions. The one that most likely comes to mind is EU Council. And why is that? He has a knack of being able to work with politicians of very diverse background. He's managed a coalition with the populist right. He's managed a coalition with the Social Democrats, and now in a 4-party construct. And I think that gives him a degree of dexterity in terms of politics that is required for the job of being EU Council president. So who knows? He's hinted at that this is his last coalition, say that runs for the full 4 years. We'll be having discussions about who takes over from von der Leyen and Michel in about 3 years' time, Duncan. So I'm looking forward to the Charlemagne columns about that.
Yes. And Caroline,
there's another job that we have to look at, which is becoming vacant in, I think, 1.5 years. That's the NATO top job. He may be more at ease there than in I talked about the ambivalence of the Dutch, and maybe Rutte embodies this. The heart beats in a very Atlantic and transatlantic way. But, when we think rationally, we realize we're on the continent. This is how we, earn a living. We're always happier when the two are reconciled. So I think Rutte is too. And as far as I heard, he wasn't really in for the council job. Many people were still surprised that he kept saying no. So it was a pure walkover for Charles Michel. Let's watch what happens when Stoltenberg finishes his term.
But you're not suggesting, surely, Caroline, that he would let the government collapse 1.5 years?
But maybe he can do it without letting the government collapse. We will see.
Excellent. On that very tantalising glimpse of the future, I think we can leave it there. There's no more questions.
Speculation,
in the chat. Speculation, but very well informed speculation. So two very different things. Thank you both for taking the time. That was absolutely fascinating for me and for everyone who was able to listen to that. Apologies for my own Wi-Fi connection and making that a bit of a farce. But thank you for taking the time. I've learned a lot, and hopefully everyone else has as well.
Bye-bye.
So let's wrap it up there.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.